There's a particular kind of person people rely on, not occasionally, consistently. The one who replies, shows up, fixes things before they become problems. The reliable one, it sounds like a compliment. And often it is, but over time, something else begins to form underneath it, something quieter and more expensive, because reliability, when left unchecked, starts to carry a cost that isn't immediately visible, not at first. At first, it feels efficient. You become the default. People come to you because they know you won't let things slip. You don't miss deadlines. You don't forget details. You don't create uncertainty. And in a world that often feels unpredictable, that has value, real value. So naturally, more comes your way, more responsibility, more expectations, more trust. And again, that sounds like progress, but it isn't always, because the system around you begins to adjust quietly without anyone announcing it. Tasks that used to be shared start drifting toward you. Decisions that others might have handled pause, waiting for you. Not because people are lazy, but because you've removed the risk. You've made it safe to depend on you. And slowly, without meaning to, you become a kind of infrastructure, essential, but taken for granted. That's where the cost begins to accumulate. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts. You notice you're the one who stays a bit later, not dramatically later, just enough. You're the one who double checks things others don't, the one who follows up, the one who smooths over gaps before they become visible. It doesn't feel like a burden. Not immediately. It feels like competence, like being in control, but control has a hidden trade off. It ties you to everything, and the more you're tied in, the less space you have to step back, to think differently, to experiment, to take risks, because reliability and risk don't sit comfortably together. Reliability prefers predictability, it prefers systems that work, processes that repeat, outcomes that can be trusted, which means over time you start avoiding things that might disrupt that pattern, even if those things are exactly what would move you forward. That's the first shift. You become excellent at maintaining, less inclined to explore, and it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, almost invisible. Then there's the second cost. People stop checking in on you, not out of neglect, but assumption. You're fine. You always are. You don't complain. You don't drop things. You don't create friction. So, from the outside, everything looks stable, which means fewer people ask if you're overloaded. Fewer people offer help because you've never needed it before, at least not visibly. And that creates a strange imbalance. You carry more, but receive less. Less support, less attention, less consideration. Again, not intentionally, just logically, because systems optimize around what works, and you work consistently. There's also something else, a kind of identity lock in. When you're known as the reliable one, it becomes harder to be anything else. If you suddenly say no, it feels noticeable. If you drop something, it feels out of character. If you prioritize yourself, it can even feel uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because it breaks the pattern people have come to expect, including you. You start to hold yourself to that standard even when no one is explicitly asking you to, and that's where it becomes internal. You don't just act reliable, you feel responsible for everything, and responsibility, when it expands too far, stops being useful. It becomes heavy, not dramatically heavy, just constantly present, a background weight. You carry conversations in your head, loose ends, unfinished tasks, things that might go wrong. You preempt problems before they exist, which sounds efficient, but it's also exhausting because your mind rarely switches off. There's always something to track, something to fix, something to anticipate. And over time, that changes how you experience your own life. Even outside of work, You become the organizer, the planner, the one who makes sure things run smoothly. Again, valuable, but also limiting, because it reduces your ability to simply be present, to let things unfold without managing them, to not be in charge. That's the third cost. You lose a degree of spontaneity, not completely, but noticeably. Then there's recognition, or rather the lack of it. Reliability is rarely celebrated in obvious ways because when things go right, nothing stands out. No issues, no crises, no visible problems, which means your contribution becomes invisible. You're maintaining a system that appears to run itself, and systems that appear to run themselves don't attract attention. Ironically, the better you are, the less visible you become, unless something goes wrong. And when it does, expectations snap back immediately. You're the one who fixes it, because you always have. So you're most visible when there's a problem, and least visible when there isn't. That's a difficult position to sustain because it disconnects effort from recognition. You're putting in more, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's seen or valued, not fully. And over time, that creates a quiet kind of frustration, not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. A sense that you're doing a lot, but not moving proportionally. That's often where people start to feel stuck, not because they lack ability, but because their ability has been channeled into stability instead of progression, which brings us to the core issue. Reliability solves immediate problems, but it can quietly block long term growth because growth requires a degree of disruption, trying new things, letting some things fail, stepping away from what's already working. And if you're the one keeping everything working, stepping away feels risky, even irresponsible. So you stay, you maintain, you optimize, and you become very, very good at it. But the system you've helped build starts to depend on you in a specific way, not as someone who evolves it, but as someone who sustains it. That's a subtle distinction, but an important one because sustaining and evolving require different behaviors. Sustaining is about consistency, evolving is about change. And you can't fully optimize for both at the same time. Eventually, something has to give. Either the system stays stable or it grows. And if you're always protecting stability, growth tends to slow down, including your own. So, what's the alternative? It's not about becoming unreliable. That's not the point. The point is to adjust the boundaries around your reliability, to be deliberate about where it applies and where it doesn't, because reliability without boundaries turns into obligation, and obligation over time removes choice. So the shift is subtle. You don't stop showing up. You stop showing up to everything. You don't stop helping. You become selective about how and when you help. You allow small gaps to exist, not because you don't care, but because constant coverage prevents others from stepping in and it prevents the system from adapting. That can feel uncomfortable. At first, there's a temptation to step back in, to fix, to smooth things over. But sometimes the most useful thing you can do is not intervene immediately, to let things be slightly imperfect, because that imperfection creates space for others to take responsibility, for new solutions to emerge, for you to step into something different. That's where the shift happens, not in a dramatic change, but in a gradual rebalancing. You remain reliable, but not universally available. You remain dependable, but not endlessly accommodating. And in that space, something interesting starts to return: time, attention, energy, not all at once, but enough. Enough to think more clearly, enough to notice opportunities you previously ignored, enough to consider paths that don't rely on constant maintenance. And with that, your role begins to evolve. You're no longer just the one who keeps things running. You become someone who can shape what runs next. That's a different kind of value, less visible in the short term, but far more significant over time. And perhaps the most important part, you start to feel lighter, not because you're doing nothing, but because you're no longer carrying everything. And that difference matters more than it seems, because being the reliable one isn't the problem. It's being only the reliable one. That's where the cost hides, quietly, until you decide to look at it. And once you do, it's difficult to unsee, not immediately, but eventually that's where it shifts.